A woman stands alone in a room full of laughter, not with her, but at her. The rejection wasn't quiet. It was designed to destroy. In front of 50 witnesses, Lydia Moore learned that the marriage she crossed 1,000 miles for was nothing but a cruel joke. The man who promised her everything called her worthless. The crowd roared, and in that moment, she had two choices: crumble into dust or find a way to survive. This is the story of how one woman refused to disappear. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The saloon smelled like sweat, whiskey, and something darker: humiliation that hadn't yet found its victim. Lydia Moore stood just inside the doorway, her traveling dress wrinkled and dusty from 3 weeks on a cramped stagecoach. Her hands clutched a single worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. The letter that had brought her here, the letter promising marriage, stability, a future, was folded in her pocket, the paper soft from being read and reread until the words had burned themselves into her memory. Come to Redemption Creek. I am a man of means and reputation. You will want for nothing. We will marry upon your arrival. It was signed Harrison Blackwell. The name alone had carried weight when she'd shown the letter to the women at the boarding house in Philadelphia. Harrison Blackwell. Land baron. Cattle king. A man who owned half the county and controlled the other half through sheer force of will. And he had chosen her. Lydia had never considered herself particularly beautiful. Practical? Yes. Hardworking? Absolutely. But beautiful? No. She was too tall, too angular, with hands that showed the evidence of years spent scrubbing floors and mending clothes for people who barely remembered her name. When the letter arrived, forwarded through a matrimonial agency she'd contacted in a moment of desperate hope, it had felt like a miracle. Now, standing in the crowded saloon with every eye in the room turning toward her, Lydia felt the first whisper of doubt. The piano player stopped mid-song. Conversations died like candles snuffed out one by one. A man near the bar, thick-necked and red-faced, elbowed his companion and pointed at her with his chin. That her? Has to be, the other replied, not bothering to lower his voice. Look at that dress. Came a long way to get her heart broke. Lydia's spine stiffened. She scanned the room, searching for the face she'd memorized from the small photograph that had accompanied the letter. Distinguished. Silver-haired. Confident. She found him at a corner table. Harrison Blackwell sat like a king holding court, surrounded by men in expensive suits and women in silk dresses that cost more than Lydia had earned in a year. He was exactly as his photograph had promised, handsome in that carefully maintained way of wealthy men, his silver hair swept back, his suit tailored to perfection. He was also laughing, not at a joke someone had told, at her. Lydia's stomach dropped. Mr. Blackwell? Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, nearly swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. Harrison Blackwell didn't stand, didn't even set down his whiskey glass. So you actually came. His voice carried easily, projected for the entertainment of his audience. I'll be damned. Johnson, you owe me $5. I told you she'd be stupid enough to show up. Laughter erupted from the table. One of the silk-dressed women pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with malicious amusement. Lydia's ears rang. I don't understand. Your letter said... My letter said a lot of things. Harrison finally stood, but only to better display himself to the room. Tell me, sweetheart, did you really think a man like me would marry a woman like you? The words hit like physical blows. You wrote to the agency, Lydia said, hating the tremor in her voice. You requested a joke. Harrison picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid. My associates and I were discussing the desperate state of frontier women, the lengths they'll go to, the lies they'll believe. And I said, I bet I could get one to travel 1,000 miles on nothing but empty promises. He gestured grandly toward her. And here you are, proof that I was right. The room exploded into laughter, loud, cruel, overwhelming. Lydia couldn't breathe. One of the men at Harrison's table slapped the surface hard enough to rattle the glasses. Christ, Harrison, that's cold even for you. Cold? Harrison grinned. I call it efficient. I didn't even have to try. One letter, a few pretty words, and she came running like a dog after a bone. Please. The word escaped Lydia before she could stop it, and she hated herself for it. I spent everything I had to get here. The agency fee, the coach fare. I have nowhere. Not my problem. Harrison's expression didn't flicker. You made your choices. You believed what you wanted to believe. That's not on me. But you promised. I promised nothing. His voice hardened, losing its performative charm. You read romance into business correspondence. You created a fantasy in your desperate little head. And now you're here, expecting me to play along because you were foolish enough to gamble your entire future on a stranger's word? He looked her up and down with theatrical disgust. Look at you. You really thought you were good enough for this? He gestured at himself, at his expensive suit, his polished boots. You're nobody. You have nothing. You are nothing. What could you possibly offer a man of my standing? Lydia's vision blurred. Don't cry. Don't give them that satisfaction. But the tears came anyway, hot and humiliating, streaming down her face while 50 strangers watched and laughed and drank in her destruction like fine wine. Ah, she's crying, one of the silk-dressed women cooed in mock sympathy. How precious. Somebody get her a handkerchief, another man called out. Or better yet, a ticket back east. She can't afford one, Harrison said, clearly enjoying himself now. Can you, sweetheart? You spent every penny getting here. You're stranded. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Stranded. No money, no family, no prospects. In a town where everyone now knew she was the fool who'd traveled 1,000 miles for a marriage that never existed. Lydia wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to unmake every decision that had led her to this moment, but her legs wouldn't move. Harrison turned back to his table, already dismissing her. Somebody show her out. This was entertaining, but I'm bored now. A large man in a stained apron, the saloon owner, Lydia assumed, moved toward her. Come on, miss. Best you leave. Where am I supposed to go? The question came out as a whisper. He shrugged. Not my concern. Can't have you standing there making the customers uncomfortable. Making them uncomfortable. The absurdity of it struck Lydia like a slap. Move along, the saloon owner said, not unkindly, but with the firmness of a man who'd made up his mind. Nothing for you here. Lydia's hands tightened on her carpetbag. She should leave. Should salvage what little dignity remained and walk out of this place with her head high. But where? Into the street? To sleep in an alley? To beg for work in a town that had just watched her public humiliation? I said move. Wait. The voice came from the back of the room, quiet but carrying enough authority to stop the saloon owner mid-reach. Lydia turned. A man stood in the shadows near the far wall, half hidden in the dim light that barely reached that corner of the saloon. She hadn't noticed him before. No one had, from the way every head swiveled in surprise. He stepped forward into the lamplight. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing clothes that had seen better days, a shirt that might have once been white, pants held up with a worn belt, boots that were scuffed and dusty. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. But it was the scar that caught Lydia's attention, a thick, jagged line that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent half-grimace. The room went quiet again, but this silence felt different, wary. Caleb Rowe. Harrison's voice had lost some of its performative swagger. Didn't know you were here. I wasn't planning to be involved. The scarred man, Caleb, spoke slowly, each word deliberate. His voice was rough, like gravel being dragged across leather. But I changed my mind. Changed your mind about what? Caleb's eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on Lydia. Her. Harrison laughed, but it sounded forced. You can't be serious. Do I look like I joke? Caleb moved closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet from Lydia, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back, but she held her ground. Miss, Caleb said, not to Harrison, but directly to her. You need a solution to your problem? Lydia's throat was too tight to speak. She nodded. I have one. He paused. It's not charity. It's not kindness. It's a transaction. What kind of transaction? Her voice barely worked. Marriage. The word fell like a stone into still water. Somewhere in the room, someone gasped. Harrison stood up so fast his chair scraped across the floor. You can't be serious, Ro. She's nobody. She's somebody who needs protection and a roof. Caleb didn't look at Harrison. His attention remained fixed on Lydia. And I need... He stopped, jaw working like the words cost him something. I need help. My ranch is failing. My land is weeks from being seized. A wife would give me legal standing to renegotiate the debt terms, would buy me time. Time, Lydia repeated. 6 months. Maybe a year. Caleb's expression didn't change. After that, if you want to leave, you leave. I won't stop you. But while you're there, you work. You earn your keep. This isn't a rescue. It's a business arrangement, Lydia said slowly. Exactly. Harrison strode toward them, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. Ro, you're barely keeping your own head above water. What makes you think... I wasn't asking your permission. Caleb's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Harrison stop mid-sentence. Miss, I'm offering you a choice. Take it or don't. Lydia looked at him, really looked at him. There was no warmth in his face, no sympathy, no pity, just cold, practical calculation. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering to use her. And somehow, that felt more honest than anything else that had happened in the last 10 minutes. What do you get out of this? She asked. I told you, time, and someone to help run the ranch while I deal with the creditors and the bank. And what do I get? A name that isn't dirt in this town. A roof, food, protection from men like him. Caleb jerked his chin toward Harrison. And when the debt is settled, if it gets settled, you get to decide if you stay or go. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even kindness. But it was something. It was a foothold when she had none. How do I know you won't? Lydia swallowed. How do I know I'll be safe? You don't. Caleb's bluntness was almost refreshing. But I'm not the one who brought you here to mock you in front of a crowd, and I'm not the one who's going to throw you into the street tonight. Fair point, Lydia's mind raced. Every option felt like a trap. Stay here and become the town's permanent joke. Try to find work and housing with no references, no connections, and a reputation already destroyed before she'd spent a single night in Redemption Creek. Or take this stranger's offer and gamble her safety on the word of a man she'd met 30 seconds ago. There's a preacher across the street, Caleb said. We can do this now if you want. Or you can walk away and figure out your own solution. Now. Lydia's head spun. Why wait? You got somewhere better to be? The brutal honesty of it almost made her laugh. No, she didn't. This is insane, Harrison said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Lydia, that's your name, right? Don't be stupid twice in one day. Ro is a nobody. His ranch is worthless. He's offering you nothing. Lydia looked at Harrison Blackwell, the man who'd promised her everything and delivered public humiliation instead. Then she looked at Caleb Rowe, the scarred stranger who promised her nothing but honesty. Yes, she said. Caleb's expression didn't change. Yes, what? Yes, I'll marry you. For the first time, something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Surprise? Relief? She couldn't tell. All right, then. He turned toward the door. Come on. Lydia picked up her carpet bag and followed him. Behind them, the saloon erupted in chaos. Harrison shouting, people arguing, someone laughing like this was all the best entertainment they'd had in years. Lydia didn't look back. She walked out into the dusty street, following a stranger toward a future that terrified her. But at least it was her choice this time. The preacher's house sat across from the saloon, a small wooden building with a hand-painted sign that read, Reverend Thomas Shaw. Marriages, baptisms, burials. Caleb knocked once, then pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. A thin man in his 60s looked up from a desk cluttered with papers and books. His eyebrows rose when he saw Caleb, then rose higher when he saw Lydia behind him. Caleb Rowe. Didn't expect to see you darkening my door. Need a wedding, Caleb said flatly. Reverend Shaw blinked. You're joking. Do I look like I'm joking? The Reverend studied Caleb's face, then Lydia's. Whatever he saw there made him close his mouth and stand up. I'll need witnesses. Get them. Shaw disappeared through a back door and returned moments later with two people, a middle-aged woman in an apron who looked bewildered, and a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. This is highly irregular, Shaw said, but he was already pulling out a worn Bible and a marriage ledger. I'll need names. Caleb Rowe. Lydia Moore. Shaw wrote slowly, his pen scratching across the page. And you're both entering into this marriage of your own free will? Yes, Caleb said. Lydia hesitated for just a heartbeat. Then, yes. Any legal impediments? Prior marriages, familial relations, that sort of thing? No. No. Shaw sighed like a man who knew he was participating in something unwise, but couldn't quite figure out how to stop it. All right then, let's make this official. The ceremony was brutally efficient. Shaw read from his Bible in a monotone that suggested he'd performed this ritual so many times the words had lost all meaning. He asked the required questions. Caleb and Lydia gave the required answers. When it came time for rings, there were none. We'll skip that part, Caleb said. Shaw didn't argue. By the power vested in me by the territory and the church, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Shaw closed his Bible with a snap. Sign here. Lydia's hand shook as she signed her name in the ledger. Caleb's signature was barely legible, more of a scrawl than proper letters. That's it? Lydia asked. That's it, Shaw confirmed. You're married. May it bring you both what you're looking for, whatever that might be. It wasn't exactly a blessing, but Lydia suspected it was the best they were going to get. Caleb paid Shaw from a small leather pouch that looked distressingly light. Then he turned to Lydia. Got a horse? No? Can you ride? A little. Good enough. Caleb headed for the door. Ranch is an hour north. We leave now. We get there before full dark. Lydia followed him out into the street where a horse waited, a sturdy brown mare that looked as tired and practical as everything else about Caleb Rowe. He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended his hand down to her. Lydia took it. His grip was calloused, strong. He pulled her up behind him with surprising gentleness, settling her on the horse's back. Hold on, he said. Lydia wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the lean muscle beneath his shirt, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The horse started moving. As they rode past the saloon, Lydia saw faces pressed against the windows, watching them leave. She thought she saw Harrison among them, his expression twisted with something that might have been anger or might have been disbelief. She didn't care. She was leaving, with a husband whose last name she'd learned 10 minutes ago. Riding toward a failing ranch she'd never seen, to start a marriage built on desperation and debt. And somehow, despite everything, Lydia felt the tiniest spark of something that might have been hope, or maybe just relief that she wasn't drowning alone anymore. But they rode in silence. The landscape changed from town to scrubland, from wooden buildings to endless stretches of brown grass and twisted trees that looked like they'd been fighting the wind their whole lives. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. Lydia's arms ached from holding on, her legs cramped from the unfamiliar position. But she didn't complain. Caleb hadn't said a word since they'd left town. Finally, as the last light began to fade, he spoke. That's it. Lydia looked up. A ranch house appeared in the distance, or what remained of one. A single-story structure that might have once been white but was now a weathered gray. Fences that leaned at dangerous angles, a barn with missing boards and a roof that sagged in the middle. Everything about it screamed failure. It's not much, Caleb said, and for the first time Lydia heard something other than flat pragmatism in his voice. Something that might have been shame. It's shelter, Lydia replied. Caleb made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That's generous. They reached the house as full darkness fell. Caleb dismounted and helped Lydia down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit solid ground. Stable's there, Caleb pointed to the listing barn. I'll get the horse settled. You can Go inside, I guess. He walked away, leading the mare toward the barn, leaving Lydia standing alone in the dark. She picked up her carpet bag and approached the house. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed, hanging slightly ajar on what sounded like a broken hinge. Lydia pushed it open. The smell hit her first: dust, old smoke, something that might have been rotting food. She fumbled in the darkness until her hand found a lamp on a table near the door. Matches sat beside it. Light bloomed. Lydia's heart sank. The interior was worse than the exterior. A single large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A cast-iron stove sat cold and crusted with old grease. Dishes were piled in a basin, not dirty from tonight or yesterday, but from weeks ago. Growing things that Lydia didn't want to examine too closely. A table held the remains of what might have once been meals. The floor was tracked with mud and dust, and in the far corner, a single bed with blankets that looked like they hadn't been washed in months. One bed. Lydia's stomach clenched. The door opened behind her. Caleb stepped inside, taking in her expression and following her gaze to the bed. "Right," he said. "Should have mentioned that. There's only one bed." "Yes." "We're married." "Yes." "I don't—" Lydia swallowed. "I can't—" "I'll sleep in the barn," Caleb said flatly. "I've done it before. This was a business arrangement, remember? I'm not expecting anything else." Relief flooded through Lydia so strongly her knees went weak. "Thank you," Caleb shrugged. "Like I said, not charity. You'll work for your keep, starting tomorrow." "What needs doing?" He laughed then, an actual laugh, harsh and bitter. "What doesn't need doing? The place is falling apart. Livestock needs tending, fences need mending, house needs everything." He gestured at the disaster around them. "I've been keeping the ranch alive alone for 2 years since my ranch hand left. Barely managing, hence the debt." "I can clean," Lydia said. "I can cook. I can work." "Good." Caleb moved toward the door. "Because if you can't, this arrangement ends fast. I don't have room for dead weight." "I'm not dead weight." Their eyes met. Something passed between them, an understanding maybe, or just mutual recognition of two desperate people clinging to the same sinking ship. "We'll see," Caleb said. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. Lydia stood alone in the filthy house that was now, legally, her home. She looked at the dishes, the stove, the dust-covered floor, the single window so grimy she couldn't see through it. A normal person might have sat down and cried, but Lydia Rowe now, had already spent her tears in that saloon. She set down her carpet bag, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. By the time Caleb returned to the house the next morning, he almost didn't recognize it. The dishes were clean and stacked neatly on shelves he'd forgotten existed. The stove had been scrubbed until the cast iron showed through the grease. The floor was swept and mopped. The window sparkled in the early morning light, and Lydia stood at that stove, cooking something that actually smelled good. She looked up when he entered, her hair tied back, her traveling dress replaced with something simpler that must have been from her bag. There were circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept much. "Coffee's hot," she said. "Eggs will be ready in a minute." Caleb stared. "You worked all night." "Couldn't sleep anyway." Lydia flipped an egg with practiced efficiency. "Seemed like a better use of time than lying awake." "You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." She looked at him directly. "You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You gave me a way forward when I was stranded. The least I can do is make this place livable. You said I'd work for my keep, so I'm working." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He sat down at the now clean table and accepted the plate of eggs and the coffee she poured him. It was the best breakfast he'd had in 2 years. They ate in silence, not comfortable, but not hostile either. Just two strangers navigating the strange reality they'd created. When he finished, Caleb stood. "I've got fence lines to check, cattle to count. Should take most of the day." "What do you want me to do?" He gestured vaguely at the house. "Whatever you think needs doing, I trust your judgment." It was possibly the first time anyone had ever said that to Lydia. "All right," she said quietly. Caleb hesitated at the door. "Lydia." She looked up. "Thank you. For the breakfast. For This, he gestured at the transformed room. You're welcome. He nodded once and left. Lydia watched him go, then turned back to survey the house. She'd made progress, but there was still so much to do. The bedroom area needed proper cleaning. The pantry needed organizing. She'd need to figure out what supplies they had, what they needed, how to stretch their resources. And beyond the house, there was the ranch itself, a mystery she'd need to understand if she was going to be any real help. But for now, for this moment, Lydia allowed herself a small smile. She'd survived her worst day. She'd found shelter, however imperfect, and she'd proven, if only to herself, that she wasn't the worthless fool Harrison Blackwell had tried to make her believe she was. She was Lydia Rowe, and she was just getting started. 3 days later, Lydia discovered the full extent of the disaster she'd married into. The house had been the easy part. Dirt could be cleaned, dishes could be washed, windows could be scrubbed, until they let in actual sunlight. But the ranch itself was a different beast entirely, a dying thing that needed more than soap and determination to survive. She'd started exploring on the second morning after Caleb had ridden out to check the northern pastures. The barn first, where she found 3 horses and stalls that desperately needed mucking out, and tack so old and cracked it looked like it would fall apart if you breathed on it too hard. Then the chicken coop, where a dozen scrawny birds pecked at bare ground because no one had scattered feed in what looked like days. The vegetable garden was a graveyard of dead plants and broken fence posts. And the cattle, when she finally climbed the hill behind the house to get a view of the grazing land, numbered maybe 40 head where there should have been hundreds. That night, when Caleb came back dust-covered and exhausted, Lydia had dinner waiting. Venison stew made from meat she'd found in the cold cellar, stretched with the last of the potatoes and some wild onions she'd foraged from near the creek. He ate in silence, the way he did everything. Lydia waited until he'd finished before she spoke. How bad is it? Caleb's hand paused on his coffee cup. What? The debt, the ranch. How bad? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down the cup and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Bad enough that I'll lose everything in 3 months if I can't make a payment to the bank, and I don't have a quarter of what they want. How much do you need? $500. Lydia's breath caught. $500 might as well have been 5,000. That's impossible. Yeah. Caleb's scarred face was expressionless, but something in his eyes looked hollow. I know. What happened? How did it get this bad? He was quiet for so long that Lydia thought he'd shut down the conversation entirely. But then he started talking, his voice low and rough. Ranch belonged to my father. He built it from nothing, spent 30 years turning scrubland into something that could actually support cattle. When he died 5 years ago, he left it to me, all of it. The land, the herd, the debt he'd taken on to expand. Caleb's hands flexed on the table. I was doing all right at first. Had a good foreman, decent ranch hands, steady market for the cattle. Then 2 years ago there was a drought, lost half the herd. The foreman took what money was left in the ranch account and disappeared. The hands left when I couldn't pay them anymore. And the bank started calling in the loans. You've been running this place alone for 2 years. Mostly. Had a kid helping out for a few months last year, but he left when his family moved east. Since then, Caleb shrugged. Been doing what I can. Selling off cattle when I need cash, letting the fences fall apart because I don't have time to fix them, watching the place die piece by piece. The defeat in his voice made something twist in Lydia's chest. Why didn't you just sell? She asked. Start over somewhere else? This land is all I have, all I am. Caleb's jaw tightened. My father broke his back for this place, built something real out of dust and stubbornness. I'm not going to be the one who loses it, even if holding on destroys you. Even then, they sat in silence, the weight of impossible odds pressing down on both of them. Finally, Lydia spoke. What if we had help? Caleb's eyes sharpened. What kind of help? The town, neighbors. There must be people who... There's nobody. The flatness in Caleb's voice cut like a blade. You think I didn't ask? The other ranchers won't help because they're struggling too. The townspeople don't care about a failing ranch 5 miles outside their borders. And after what happened with you and Harrison Blackwell, he shook his head. We're not going to find allies in Redemption Creek. Then we don't rely on them. Lydia leaned forward. We do it ourselves. Do what ourselves? Save this place. She spoke with a conviction she didn't entirely feel, but she'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you had to pretend to be brave until the real thing showed up. You said you need $500 in 3 months. That's not impossible. It's just very, very difficult. That's one way to put it. How much can we get for cattle? Depends on the market. Maybe $10, $12 a head if we're lucky. Lydia did the math in her head. So we'd need to sell about 40 head to make the payment. Oh, we don't have 40 head to sell. I've already sold most of what I could spare. What's left is barely enough to keep the ranch viable. If I sell more, there's nothing to rebuild with, even if we do save the land. Then we don't sell cattle. Lydia stood up and started clearing the dishes, her mind racing. We find another way. There is no other way. There's always another way. She turned to face him. Tomorrow I want you to show me everything. The whole operation. What works, what doesn't, what we have, what we need. If I'm going to be your partner in this, I need to understand what we're fighting. Partner, Caleb repeated, something unreadable in his voice. That's what you said, wasn't it? This is a business arrangement, so let's treat it like one. Let me help. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his scarred face hard to read in the lamplight. All right, he said finally. Tomorrow. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of weather that made everything feel heavier than it was. Caleb woke Lydia before dawn, and together they set out to survey the ranch. He showed her the pastures first, vast stretches of brown grass interrupted by rocky outcroppings and scraggly trees. The cattle were scattered, harder to count than Lydia had expected. Caleb pointed out the problems. Weak fencing that let the herd wander too far, lack of proper grazing rotation, water sources that were drying up as autumn deepened. We lose more cattle to wandering than to anything else, Caleb explained as they rode along the fence line. They get through the gaps, wander onto neighboring land, get mixed up with other herds. By the time I realize they're gone, it's too late to get them back. So we fix the fences. With what? Fencing costs money I don't have, and even if I did, it would take weeks to repair all the breaks. I don't have weeks. Lydia filed that away and kept asking questions. He showed her the creek that ran along the eastern border of the property, currently reduced to a trickle. This is our main water source. When it's full, it's enough for the whole herd, but we haven't had decent rain in 6 months. What about wells? Dry, or close to it. The windmill's broken. Been meaning to fix it, but... He trailed off, the unspoken, but I haven't had time hanging between them. They checked the barn next, where Lydia saw that her initial assessment had been generous. The roof wasn't just sagging, it was actively leaking. The stalls needed complete reconstruction. The tack room was a disaster of rotting leather and rusted metal. This is where we used to keep equipment for roundups, Caleb said, gesturing to an empty corner. Sold most of it to make last year's payment. What about tools? Basic repairs? Got what I need to keep things from completely falling apart. That's about it. By midday, Lydia had seen enough to understand the full scope of the problem. The ranch wasn't just failing, it was being held together by Caleb's sheer stubborn refusal to let it die. Every fence, every building, every piece of equipment was on the verge of collapse, and Caleb himself looked like he was running on fumes and spite. They stopped for lunch by the creek, sitting on rocks while the horses drank from the shallow water. Lydia pulled out the bread and cheese she'd packed, divided it evenly, and handed Caleb his half. Thank you, he said quietly. You keep thanking me for basic things. Because nobody's done basic things for me in a long time. The admission hung in the air between them. Lydia took a bite of bread, chewed thoughtfully, then said, I think we need to prioritize. Meaning? Meaning we can't fix everything. We don't have the time or resources. So we focus on what will keep us alive for the next 3 months, and we let everything else wait. Caleb tilted his head, listening. First priority, the cattle. We need to stop losing them. That means fixing enough fence to contain the herd in the main pasture. Not the whole fence line, just enough to create a secure perimeter. That's still a lot of fence. Can you show me how to do it? Caleb blinked. You want to help repair fence? I want to help with whatever needs doing. Can you teach me or not? A ghost of something that might have been respect flickered across his face. Yeah, I can teach you. Good. Second priority, water. If the cattle don't have reliable water, everything else is pointless. Can the windmill be fixed? Probably, if I can figure out what's wrong with it. Then that's priority 2. Third priority, the payment. We need a plan to get $500, and selling cattle isn't going to cut it. So we need to think of alternatives. Like what? I don't know yet. Lydia met his eyes. But we have 3 months. We'll figure it out. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. You really think we can do this? He asked finally. I think we don't have a choice but to try. He nodded slowly. All right then. We start with the fence. They spent the rest of the day working side by side on the southern fence line. Caleb showed Lydia how to dig post holes, how to stretch wire, how to secure it properly so it would hold against the weight of cattle testing its strength. The work was brutal. Her hands blistered within an hour, her back screamed in protest, and the sun beat down on them without mercy despite the cool morning. But she didn't stop. And Caleb noticed. You don't have to prove anything, he said as they worked on the 10th post of the day. I'm not proving anything. Lydia hammered a staple into place, securing the wire. I'm doing what needs doing. Most women didn't get publicly humiliated and then marry a stranger out of desperation. She looked up at him, sweat dripping down her face. I'm not most women, and I'm not going to be dead weight on this ranch. Caleb's scarred mouth twitched into what might have been the beginning of a smile. No, I don't suppose you are. They worked until dusk, managing to secure nearly 100 yards of fence line. It wasn't much compared to what still needed doing, but it was progress. That night, over another simple dinner, they made a plan. We'll work the fence every day, Caleb said. 3-4 hours at least. Should have the main pasture secured within 2 weeks if we keep at it. And the windmill? I'll look at it tomorrow. Might need parts I don't have. Can we make parts? Caleb paused, considering. Maybe. There's a forge in the barn I haven't used in years. If I can get it working, I might be able to fabricate what we need. Do it. He nodded, then hesitated. Lydia, about the money. I'm thinking about it. Give me time. But time was the one thing they didn't have. The following week fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely satisfying. Every morning, Lydia woke before dawn to make breakfast and pack lunch. Then she and Caleb would work the fence line until midday, come back to the ranch for a quick meal, and spend the afternoon on other critical repairs. Caleb focused on getting the forge operational and working on the windmill. Lydia took over all the livestock care, feeding the horses and chickens, collecting eggs, milking the single cow they had left. In the evenings, after dinner, Lydia would work on the house while Caleb handled paperwork or worked on equipment repairs by lamplight. They rarely talked beyond what was necessary, but a kind of understanding was developing between them, a recognition that they were in this together, even if neither of them had chosen it. On the 8th day, Lydia made a discovery. She'd been cleaning out the pantry, taking stock of their dwindling supplies, when she found a box shoved in the back corner. Inside were jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, dozens of them, covered in dust but still sealed. "Caleb," she called. He appeared in the doorway, grease-stained from working on the forge. "What's wrong? Where did these come from?" He looked at the jars, and something in his expression shuddered. "My mother. She used to preserve everything from the garden. Died 7 years ago. I forgot those were there." Lydia turned a jar in her hands, examining the perfect seal. "These are still good." "Probably." "Caleb, do you know what this means? That we have food we forgot about? That your mother knew how to preserve food, which means there are people in town who don't know how, who would pay for preserved goods." Lydia's mind raced. The garden is dead now, but it's early enough in the season that we could still plant a late crop. Root vegetables mostly, carrots, beets, turnips, things that store well. If we can get a harvest in the next 6 weeks, I can preserve them and sell them in town. Caleb frowned. "That's a lot of ifs." "It's a possibility. That's more than we had yesterday." Lydia set down the jar. "How much would seeds cost?" Not much, maybe $5, $10 for what we'd need. Do we have $10? Caleb's jaw worked. Barely. Then we spend it, we plant, and I learn to preserve. If it works, we have a new income source. If it doesn't, we're only out $10. And a lot of work. We're already working ourselves to death. What's a little more? This time, Caleb definitely smiled. You're relentless, you know that? I've been called worse. The next day, Caleb rode to town and returned with seed packets, carrots, beets, turnips, and onions. While he continued working on the windmill, Lydia attacked the garden with a fury. She pulled out the dead plants, turned the soil until her muscles screamed, created neat rows, and planted every seed with methodical precision. It was backbreaking work, but it was also hope planted in neat lines. 2 weeks after Lydia's arrival, the fence was done. It wasn't perfect. There were spots where the wire didn't stretch quite tight enough, posts that leaned at angles that weren't quite vertical, but it was functional. It would hold. They spent an entire day rounding up the scattered cattle and driving them into the newly secured pasture. Caleb worked with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this his whole life, anticipating the animals' movements, directing them with nothing but his horse and a rope. Lydia did her best to help, learning as she went, occasionally making mistakes that sent cattle scattering but gradually improving. By sunset, all 43 head were secured. They stood by the fence, watching the cattle settle into their new confinement, and for the first time since Lydia had arrived, Caleb looked almost relaxed. We did it, he said quietly. First step, Lydia replied. Still a long way to go. Always the optimist. Someone has to be. Caleb turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. Why are you doing this? What do you mean, this? He gestured at the fence, the cattle, the ranch. You could have left, could have told me this wasn't what you signed up for and walked away. The marriage was legal, but I wouldn't have stopped you. Why stay? Lydia considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, woven from pride and desperation and a stubborn refusal to be defeated twice in 1 month. But there was something else too, something she was only beginning to understand. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not working for someone who sees me as disposable, she said finally. You need me here. The work I do matters. That's worth more than you probably realize. Caleb's scarred face was unreadable in the fading light. It matters, he said quietly. You matter. The words hung between them, unexpected and heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Lydia cleared her throat. We should get back. Still have to feed the horses. Right. Yeah. They walked back to the barn in silence, but it felt different now, less like two strangers coexisting and more like two people beginning to recognize each other as allies. That night, as Lydia lay in the now clean bed in the now livable house, she found herself thinking about Caleb sleeping in the barn. It had been 3 weeks, and he'd never once complained, never once suggested that maybe, since they were married, he had certain rights. He'd kept his word. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. So why did that fact leave her feeling vaguely unsettled? She pushed the thought away and focused on more practical concerns. The garden was planted, the fence was done, the cattle were secured, the windmill repairs were progressing slowly but steadily. They were making progress. But they still needed $500 in less than 10 weeks, and selling preserved vegetables wasn't going to cut it. The answer came from an unexpected source. 3 days later, Lydia was in town buying supplies: flour, sugar, lamp oil, things they couldn't make or grow themselves. Caleb had given her a short list and enough money to cover it, with strict instructions to spend nothing extra. She was at the general store counting coins with meticulous care when a woman approached her. You're Lydia Rowe. It wasn't a question. Lydia looked up to find a woman in her 40s, well-dressed but with work-roughened hands, studying her with open curiosity. I am, Lydia confirmed warily. Margaret Chen. My husband owns the restaurant 2 doors down. The woman's expression was hard to read. I heard what happened at the Saloon, with Harrison Blackwell. Lydia's stomach clenched. I'd rather not. I wanted to say I'm glad you stood up for yourself. Margaret's voice was firm. That man is a snake. What he did to you was cruel, and you deserved better. The unexpected kindness nearly knocked Lydia off balance. Thank you. I also heard you married Caleb Rowe. News travels fast. In a town this size, everything travels fast. Margaret paused. I knew Caleb's mother, good woman, taught me how to preserve vegetables using the Chinese methods my grandmother used. I heard you're planning to try your hand at it. Lydia blinked. How did you? Caleb bought seeds, people notice. Margaret smiled. If you need help learning the techniques, come by the restaurant. I'll show you what I know, no charge. Why would you do that? Because women in this town need to help each other, and because I think Harrison Blackwell needs to see that you're not going anywhere. Margaret's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. Consider it a small act of rebellion. Lydia felt something warm bloom in her chest. I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how demanding I am as a teacher. Margaret turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Lydia? If you can make decent preserved goods, I'll buy them. My restaurant goes through vegetables faster than I can source them, and local is always better than shipped. So work hard, learn well, and maybe we can both benefit. She walked away before Lydia could respond. Lydia stood frozen, her mind reeling. A buyer, a guaranteed buyer willing to pay for preserved goods. It wasn't $500, but it was a start. That evening, she told Caleb about the encounter. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Margaret Chen, he said when she finished. Huh. You know her? Everyone knows her. She runs the best restaurant in 3 counties. If she's offering to buy from us, Caleb leaned back in his chair. That could actually work, but you'd need to produce a lot to make any real money. How much is a lot? Dozens of jars, maybe hundreds if you want to make a dent in what we owe. Then I'll make hundreds. Lydia, that's possible. It's possible. She met his eyes. We have the garden planted. We have your mother's jars. We have a buyer. All I need is to learn the technique and put in the work. I can do this. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right. Then we do this. Over the next month, Lydia's life became a blur of work that started before dawn and ended long after dark. She spent mornings with Margaret Chen learning the precise techniques of preservation, the temperatures, the timing, the balance of salt and sugar and vinegar that meant the difference between food that would last all winter and food that would spoil in weeks. Margaret was a demanding teacher, accepting nothing less than perfection, but she was also generous with her knowledge and surprisingly encouraging. Afternoons were spent in the garden, tending the growing plants with obsessive care. The crop was coming in better than Lydia had dared hope. The late summer had been unseasonably mild, and the seeds Caleb had bought were good quality. Carrots pushed their green tops through the soil, beets swelled underground, turnips grew fat and healthy. Evenings were for the house, the livestock, and the 1,000 other tasks that kept a ranch running. And through it all, Caleb worked beside her. He fixed the windmill, which now spun lazily in the wind and pumped water into the stock tank. He reinforced the barn roof. He rode the fence line daily, checking for breaks. He handled the cattle, the horses, the endless physical labor that ranching demanded. They rarely talked beyond coordinating work, but a rhythm developed between them. She learned to anticipate when he'd need help with a task too large for one person. He learned when she needed him to take over livestock duties so she could focus on preservation. They moved around each other like dancers, learning a complicated routine, gradually finding the flow. 6 weeks after their marriage, Lydia harvested the first vegetables and began preserving in earnest. The process was grueling. Each jar had to be sterilized perfectly. The vegetables had to be prepared just right, peeled, cut, blanched. The brine or pickling solution had to be exact. The sealing process had to be flawless, or the food would spoil. Lydia worked by the light of every lamp they owned, bent over the stove, sweat pouring down her face, hands cramping from the repetitive motions. Caleb found her at midnight on the 3rd night of this routine, surrounded by cooling jars. You need to sleep, he said. I need to finish these. Lydia didn't look up from the carrots she was slicing. Margaret said she'd take as many as I can produce. Every jar is money we need. Not if you work yourself to death making them. I'm fine. Lydia. His voice was firm. Look at me. She looked up. His face was serious, concerned. You've been going non-stop for weeks. You're going to burn out. I can't afford to burn out. We need $500 in 6 weeks, Caleb. I've done the math. Even if Margaret buys every jar I make, even if I sell to other buyers in town, we're going to be short, so I can't slow down. I can't stop. I have to keep going. Her voice cracked on the last word. Caleb crossed the room and gently took the knife from her hand. You're bleeding. Lydia looked down. Her hands were covered in small cuts and blisters, some of them fresh, some of them torn open from repeated use. I didn't notice, she said faintly. Because you're exhausted. Caleb guided her to a chair. Sit. I'll wrap those. I need to... The jars can wait an hour. Sit. Too tired to argue, Lydia sat. Caleb disappeared and returned with clean cloth and water. He knelt in front of her and began cleaning her hands with surprising gentleness. You don't have to do this alone, he said quietly. I know you're working just as hard. I mean the preserving. I can help. Show me what to do. Lydia stared at him. You'd help with this? Why wouldn't I? Because it's... She trailed off, suddenly unsure. Because it's women's work was what she'd almost said, but the words felt ridiculous looking at Caleb's scarred hands, carefully bandaging hers. Because it needs doing, Caleb finished for her. Same as everything else. You're not a servant, Lydia. You're my partner. You said so yourself, so let me partner with you. Something in Lydia's chest loosened. All right, she whispered. I'll show you. For the next 2 weeks, they worked together every evening. Caleb turned out to have steady hands and surprising patience for the detail work. He learned to prepare the vegetables, to mix the brines, to seal the jars properly. With 2 of them working, the output doubled. And something else changed too. The silence between them became comfortable. Occasionally, as they worked side by side at the stove, they'd talk. Nothing deep, just small observations, brief stories, fragments of their lives before this strange marriage. Lydia learned that Caleb had never wanted to be a rancher, that he dreamed of being a veterinarian but couldn't afford the schooling, that his scar came from a horse that had panicked during a storm when he was 19, that he'd been engaged once, years ago, to a woman who'd left him when his father died and the debt became clear. Caleb learned that Lydia's parents had died when she was 12, that she'd worked as a domestic servant for most of her adult life, that she'd answered the matrimonial advertisement out of sheer desperation after the woman she'd worked for had dismissed her without references for refusing her son's unwanted advances, that she'd spent her last $30 on the coach fare to Redemption Creek. They didn't share everything, but they shared enough. And slowly, carefully, something like trust began to build. 7 weeks after their marriage, Lydia delivered her first major order to Margaret Chen's restaurant. 60 jars of preserved vegetables, packed carefully in a crate Caleb had built. Margaret examined each one with a critical eye, then nodded in approval. Good work. Better than I expected for a first real batch. She paid Lydia in cash, $40, more money than Lydia had held in her hands in years. Thank you, Lydia breathed. Don't thank me. You earned it. Margaret smiled. I'll take another 60 jars next week if you can produce them. And I've been talking to some of the other business owners. The hotel wants to buy. So does the boarding house. You might have more customers than you can handle soon. Lydia's heart soared. Really? Really. You do good work, Lydia. Don't let anyone tell you different. When Lydia returned to the ranch, she found Caleb in the barn, repairing tack. She set the money on the workbench in front of him. $40, she said. First payment. Caleb stared at the bills. Then he looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face that looked like hope. We might actually do this, he said quietly. We will do this. And for the first time, Lydia truly believed it. The money came in faster than either of them had anticipated. By the end of the 8th week, Lydia had sold nearly 200 jars of preserved vegetables to buyers across Redemption Creek and the neighboring settlements. The hotel wanted pickled beets for their dining room. The boarding house needed preserved carrots and turnips to feed their winter guests. Even the saloon, the same saloon where Lydia had been humiliated, ordered 3 dozen jars of pickled onions for their bar. Lydia delivered that order herself, walking in through those doors with her head high and a crate of perfectly sealed jars in her arms. The bartender paid without comment, but she caught several familiar faces watching her with expressions that ranged from surprise to grudging respect. She didn't say a word to any of them, just took the money, turned on her heel, and walked out. The victory felt better than she'd imagined. By the start of the 10th week, they had accumulated $280. It wasn't enough. They still needed more than $200 to meet the bank's demand, but it was real progress, tangible proof that their desperate gamble might actually pay off. Then Harrison Blackwell made his move. It started small, subtle enough that at first Lydia thought she was imagining things. A fence post pulled up overnight, letting 3 cattle wander onto neighboring property. Caleb retrieved them without incident, reset the post, and thought nothing of it. 2 days later, another section of fence was cut clean through. 6 more cattle escaped before they noticed. Could be vandals, Caleb said as he repaired the damage, but his voice was tight with suspicion. Kids from town causing trouble. Or someone with a grudge, Lydia replied quietly. They both knew who she meant. The harassment escalated. Someone poisoned the water in one of the stock tanks, making 4 cattle sick. Caleb spent 3 days nursing them back to health while Lydia took over his other duties. Then the chicken coop was raided, not by foxes or coyotes, but by something that killed half the flock and left the bodies scattered like a message. Caleb rode into town the next day and went straight to the sheriff's office. He came back 2 hours later, his face like carved stone. "What did he say?" Lydia asked. "That unless I have proof someone's targeting us specifically, there's nothing he can do. Could be wild animals, could be bad luck, could be anything." Caleb's hands were white-knuckled on the reins. "He suggested I stop wasting his time. He's in Blackwell's pocket. Everyone in this town is in Blackwell's pocket. He owns half the businesses and holds loans on the other half." Caleb dismounted with barely controlled fury. "We're on our own." That night, Caleb moved back into the house. "I'm not leaving you alone here," he said, carrying his bedroll through the door. "If someone's targeting the ranch, I need to be close enough to hear trouble coming." He made a pallet on the floor near the stove, as far from the bed as the small house allowed. Lydia didn't argue. The truth was, she felt safer with him there. For 3 days, nothing happened. They worked their usual routine, Lydia managing the preserving operation that had become a small industry, Caleb handling the livestock and keeping vigilant watch over the property. They took turns staying awake at night, listening for sounds that didn't belong. On the 4th night, the barn caught fire. Lydia woke to the smell of smoke and Caleb shouting her name. "Fire! Get up!" She bolted from bed, still in her nightdress, and followed him out into the yard. Flames licked up the side of the barn, already consuming the weathered wood with terrifying speed. "The horses!" Lydia started running. "Wait!" Caleb grabbed her arm. It could be a trap. But Lydia was already pulling free, sprinting toward the barn. Through the open doors, she could hear the horses screaming in panic, the sound cutting through her like knives. She plunged into the smoke-filled interior without thinking. The heat was overwhelming. The 3 horses were in their stalls, wild-eyed with terror, throwing themselves against the gates. Lydia reached the first stall and fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanism. The gate swung open and the horse bolted past her, nearly knocking her down. Caleb appeared beside her, a wet cloth pressed over his mouth and nose. "Get out!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. "Not without them!" Lydia moved to the second stall. Together they freed all 3 horses, driving them out into the night. The cattle in the nearby pen were bellowing in fear, straining against the fence. Lydia ran to open the gate while Caleb grabbed buckets and started fighting the fire. The scene became chaos. Cattle stampeding past her in the darkness. Caleb throwing water on flames that seemed to laugh at his efforts. The barn's roof beginning to collapse with sounds like breaking bones. "It's gone!" Lydia screamed at him. "Let it go!" But Caleb kept fighting, his face streaked with soot and sweat, refusing to surrender another piece of his father's legacy to the flames. A beam cracked above him. Lydia didn't think. She threw herself forward, grabbed Caleb's arm, and pulled with all her strength. They tumbled backward together just as the beam crashed down where Caleb had been standing, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. They lay on the ground, gasping for air, watching the barn collapse in on itself. "You could have been killed," Caleb said hoarsely. "So could you." Lydia's whole body was shaking. You stubborn fool, why didn't you get out? This is all I have left, this place, this land. It's all I am. I can't just let it burn. It's already burning. Lydia sat up, anger and fear making her voice sharp. And it's not worth your life. Caleb stared at her, something raw and desperate in his eyes. It's all I know how to be. Take this away and what's left? What am I without this place? The question hung between them, more vulnerable than anything he'd ever said to her. Lydia reached out and gripped his soot-stained hand. You're more than this ranch, she said fiercely. You're more than your father's legacy or your debts or this land. And if you can't see that, then you're more of a fool than I thought. Before Caleb could respond, a voice called out from the darkness. Need help? They turned to see riders approaching, 4 of them, silhouetted against the burning barn. Lydia tensed, ready to run, but Caleb slowly got to his feet. Margaret? He called out. Margaret Chen dismounted, followed by her husband and 2 other men Lydia recognized from town. They were carrying buckets, shovels, and wet blankets. Saw the glow from town, Margaret said briskly. Figured you could use a hand. The barn's lost, Caleb said. Then we make sure the house doesn't follow. Margaret was already organizing her crew, directing them to create a fire break, to wet down the house and surrounding structures. Move, people. We don't have all night. For the next 2 hours, they fought the fire together, not to save what was already lost, but to prevent the flames from spreading. Margaret's crew worked with efficient coordination, clearly experienced with frontier firefighting. Lydia worked alongside them, hauling water from the creek until her arms felt like they'd fall off. By the time the sun started to rise, the fire was out. The barn was a smoking ruin, but the house and other structures had survived. Margaret found Lydia sitting on the porch steps, too exhausted to move. You all right? The older woman asked. I don't know. Lydia's voice was hollow. Someone did this. Someone deliberately burned our barn. I know. And the sheriff won't do anything. I know that too. Margaret sat down beside her. Harrison Blackwell has been spreading rumors about you and Caleb, saying you're troublemakers, saying the ranch is cursed. He wants you to fail. Why? What did we ever do to him? You made him look foolish, Margaret's voice was matter-of-fact. He humiliated you publicly, and you refused to disappear like you were supposed to. Instead, you married Caleb, started a business, started succeeding. Every jar you sell, every order you fulfill, it's proof that his assessment of you was wrong. And men like Harrison Blackwell can't stand being proven wrong. So he's going to destroy us. He's going to try. Margaret stood up, brushing soot from her dress. Whether he succeeds is up to you. Over the next week, more incidents occurred. Someone drove a wagon through the garden at night, destroying half the remaining crops. The water tanks were poisoned again. Fences were cut systematically, releasing cattle that took days to round up. Caleb stopped sleeping entirely. He spent every night patrolling the property, rifle in hand, waiting for whoever was targeting them to make a mistake. He came back one morning with blood on his shirt. What happened? Lydia demanded, pulling him inside. Found 2 men cutting fence on the north line. I fired a warning shot. They fired back. Caleb's voice was flat. Caught me in the shoulder. Just a graze. Just a graze. Lydia made him sit while she examined the wound. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, cutting a furrow across his upper arm, but it was still bleeding freely. You could have been killed. They ran when they realized I was shooting back. Probably didn't expect resistance. Did you recognize them? Too dark. But I know who sent them. Caleb's jaw was tight. This ends now. I'm going to Blackwell's estate tomorrow. I'm going to make him stop. If you can't just, I can and I will. This is my land, my home. I won't let him take it without a fight. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. You don't get to tell me what to do. Lydia's hands were steady as she bandaged his wound. We're partners, remember? If you're confronting Blackwell, I'm there. It could be dangerous. It's already dangerous. At least this way we face it together. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You really won't back down, will you? Would you? No. Then stop trying to make me. A ghost of a smile touched his scarred mouth. All right, we go together. They rode out the next morning, both armed, Caleb with his rifle, Lydia with a small pistol Caleb had taught her to shoot over the past week. The Blackwell estate sat on a hill overlooking the valley, a sprawling house that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. They rode past manicured gardens and white-painted fences that bore no resemblance to the hardscrabble ranches surrounding it. A man in a suit met them at the door, not Blackwell himself, but a servant or employee. Mr. Blackwell doesn't receive visitors without appointments. Tell him Caleb Rowe is here, Caleb said coldly. He'll see me. The man disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, he returned with a sneer. Mr. Blackwell says to inform you that he has no business with failed ranchers. Tell him I know he's behind the attacks on my property, Caleb called loudly enough that anyone inside could hear. Tell him I have witnesses. Tell him if it continues, You'll what? Harrison Blackwell himself appeared in the doorway, looking immaculate in an expensive suit. File a complaint with the sheriff? We both know how that'll go. Take me to court? You can't afford a lawyer. Face me yourself? He smiled coldly. You're welcome to try, Rowe, but we both know how that ends too. Why are you doing this? Lydia demanded. What do you gain from destroying us? Harrison's eyes fixed on her, cold and amused. Ah, the mail-order bride. Still clinging to your dignity, I see. Still pretending you're something more than a desperate woman who threw herself at the first man who'd have her. I'm the woman who built a business while you were busy proving what a small, petty man you really are, Lydia shot back. Every jar I sell is proof that you were wrong about me, and you can't stand it. Something dangerous flashed in Harrison's eyes. You should have disappeared, should have crawled back east where you came from. Instead, you stayed and made yourself my problem. We're not anyone's problem, Caleb said. We're just trying to survive. And that's exactly what I can't allow. Harrison's smile was pure venom. This valley has an order, a hierarchy. People like you, failures, outsiders, desperate fools. You don't belong here. You certainly don't belong anywhere near my level. So yes, I'm making sure you fail. I'm making sure everyone knows what happens when people forget their place. This is about pride, Lydia said slowly. You can't handle the fact that we're succeeding despite you. You're not succeeding. You're dying slowly, one disaster at a time. And when you finally give up and lose that pathetic ranch to the bank, I'll buy it for pennies on the dollar. Your failure becomes my profit. That's how this works. Caleb's hand moved toward his rifle. Harrison noticed and laughed. Go ahead. Shoot me on my own property in front of witnesses. See how that works out for you. The sheriff would love an excuse to hang you, Rowe. Caleb, don't. Lydia's voice was urgent. He's trying to provoke you. Smart girl, for once. Harrison turned to go back inside. Enjoy what time you have left, both of you. It's running out faster than you think. The door slammed. Caleb and Lydia rode away in tense silence. Halfway home, Caleb spoke. He's right. We can't fight him legally. Can't fight him physically without ending up dead or imprisoned. What options does that leave? We outlast him, Lydia said. We make the payment to the bank. We keep the ranch. We prove we can't be broken. And when he escalates, when he moves from harassment to something worse, then we're ready. But ready or not, the escalation came that very night. Lydia woke to the sound of gunfire and Caleb swearing viciously. She grabbed the pistol from the bedside table and ran to the window. At least 6 riders circled the house, firing into the air, driving the cattle into a panicked stampede. In the chaos, she could see them cutting the fence again, directing the animals off the property. They're stealing the herd! Caleb was already moving, rifle in hand. Stay inside! Like hell! Lydia followed him out. The scene was chaos illuminated by moonlight. The riders wore bandanas over their faces, impossible to identify, but their tactics were coordinated and efficient. They were professionals, not random vandals. Caleb fired his rifle once, twice. One rider went down. The others returned fire, forcing Caleb to dive behind the water trough. Lydia raised her pistol with shaking hands and fired at the closest rider. The shot went wide, but it startled his horse enough to make him break off. Get back inside, Caleb shouted at her. Not without you. More shots. A bullet splintered the wood next to Lydia's head. She dropped flat, heart hammering. Then new sounds cut through the chaos. More horses, more voices. Margaret Chen's voice rose above the gunfire. "That's enough!" The attacking riders wheeled their horses in confusion. Margaret and at least a dozen townspeople had arrived, all armed, forming a wall between the attackers and the ranch. "You want to steal cattle? You go through us first." Margaret's husband held a shotgun like he knew how to use it. "And trust me, we've got no problem making this a fair fight." For a long moment, the attackers hesitated. They were outnumbered now, and the element of surprise was gone. One of them made a gesture, and they wheeled their horses and rode off into the darkness, taking only the cattle they'd already separated from the herd. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Caleb slowly stood up, blood running down his face from where flying debris had cut him. "Margaret, what? We're tired of watching Blackwell destroy good people." Margaret's voice was iron. "Tonight it stops. We're standing with you, Caleb, you and Lydia both." Behind her, the townspeople nodded in agreement. A young man stepped forward, the clerk from the general store. "Blackwell's been pushing everyone around for years. We're done letting him." An older woman spoke up. "What he did to you at the saloon, Mrs. Rowe, that was disgraceful, and what he's doing now is criminal. We won't stand by anymore." Lydia felt tears burning her eyes. "Why now? Why help us?" "Because you didn't give up," Margaret said simply. "You could have left, could have let this place die. Instead, you fought. You built something. You showed us what courage looks like. That matters." Caleb looked overwhelmed, like he didn't know how to process this sudden reversal. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just let us help." Margaret surveyed the damage. "We'll post guards tonight. Make sure they don't come back. Tomorrow, we report this to the territorial marshal, not the local sheriff. And we keep doing what we've been doing, standing together." That night, townspeople set up a watch rotation around the ranch. Someone brought food. Others helped round up the scattered cattle. Margaret stayed until dawn, sitting with Lydia at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. "Why are you really doing this?" Lydia asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Because 20 years ago, I was you, new to this country, desperate for a future, clinging to hope. And people helped me when they didn't have to. Now it's my turn to help someone else." She reached across the table and squeezed Lydia's hand. "You're not alone anymore. Remember that." When morning came, it brought the territorial marshal, a hard-faced man named Webb, who listened to their story with a skepticism that gradually shifted to anger. "And you're telling me the local sheriff did nothing?" "Said we had no proof," Caleb confirmed. "The proof is all over your property." Webb surveyed the damage with a practiced eye. "Cut fences, poisoned water, and last night's attack had at least a dozen witnesses. That's enough to start asking questions." "Blackwell will deny everything." "Let him. I'll be asking questions of his ranch hands. Someone always talks eventually." Webb mounted his horse. "In the meantime, I'll have a deputy posted nearby. If there's another incident, we'll be ready." True to his word, a deputy took up residence in the area, making regular patrols. The attack stopped. But the deadline was approaching. They had less than 2 weeks to make the final payment. Despite everything, despite the setbacks and the attacks and the stolen cattle, they'd managed to save $420. They were short $80 with no time left to make it up. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the money, feeling the weight of failure settling over her. "We came so close," she whispered. Caleb stood by the window, silent. Then a knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to find Margaret Chen standing there with a cloth bag in her hands. "This is from the community," she said, setting it on the table. "Everyone who could spare something contributed. It's not charity. It's investment. When you save this ranch, you buy from local merchants. You hire local help. You become part of what makes this valley work." Lydia opened the bag with shaking hands. It was filled with money, bills and coins from dozens of contributors. "How much?" she asked, her voice barely working. $120, Margaret said. "More than you need." Lydia started crying. Caleb stood frozen, looking at the money like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Why?" he asked. "Why would anyone—" "Because you matter," Margaret said firmly. "Both of you matter. And because in the end, we're stronger together than apart. That's what community means. The day the payment was due, Caleb and Lydia rode into town together. They walked into the bank side by side, carrying $500 in carefully counted bills. The banker's expression when he saw them was almost worth the entire ordeal. "Mr. Rowe, Mrs. Rowe, I wasn't expecting payment in full," Caleb said, placing the money on the counter. "As required." But the banker counted it twice, looking for a reason to reject it. He found none. "This settles the current obligation," he said stiffly. "But there will be future—" "We'll meet future obligations when they come," Lydia interrupted. "Right now we want a receipt showing this account is current." He provided it with visible reluctance. As they left the bank, Lydia saw Harrison Blackwell across the street, watching them. His face was a mask of cold fury. She met his gaze steadily, without fear. They'd won. Not permanently, maybe. Not without scars or losses, but they'd survived. They'd fought back. They'd proven that desperation and determination could overcome wealth and power. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The victory lasted exactly 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Marshal Webb rode up to the ranch with news that drained the color from Caleb's face. "Harrison Blackwell has been arrested," Webb said without preamble. One of his ranch hands turned evidence, testified that Blackwell ordered the attacks, paid them to harass you, gave explicit instructions to drive you off your land. Lydia felt a surge of vindication so strong it made her dizzy. That's wonderful news. It would be, except for one problem. Webb's expression was grim. Blackwell made bail within 2 hours, and the judge who said it is his cousin. The trial won't happen for months, maybe longer. In the meantime, he's free and angrier than ever. Caleb's jaw tightened. "So nothing's changed." "Everything's changed. Now he knows he's been caught, and desperate men do desperate things." Webb shifted in his saddle. "I've got deputies watching his property, but I can't protect you every moment. You need to be careful." After Webb left, Caleb stood in the yard, staring at nothing. Lydia approached cautiously. "What are you thinking?" "That we won the battle and might still lose the war." His voice was hollow. "The ranch is safe for now, but Blackwell isn't going to stop. He can't afford to. If we testify against him, if this goes to trial, he loses everything. His reputation, his influence, maybe even his freedom. He'll do whatever it takes to prevent that." "Then we stay vigilant." "Vigilance won't stop a man with nothing left to lose." Caleb turned to face her. "Lydia, maybe you should leave. Go stay in town with Margaret until this is over." The suggestion hit her like a slap. "You want me to abandon you?" "I want you to be safe." "And I want to be here." "This is my home too, Caleb. I'm not running." "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I married you." Lydia stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You don't get to protect me by pushing me away. We're in this together." That was the deal. Something in Caleb's expression cracked. "I can't lose you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Lydia's breath caught. "What?" Caleb looked away, his scarred face working with emotion he clearly didn't know how to express. "I know this started as a transaction, a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it became—" He trailed off, struggling. "You're not just my wife on paper anymore. You matter to me. And the thought of something happening to you because of my problems, our problems," Lydia corrected softly. "And I matter to you?" "Yes." The admission came out rough. More than I planned, more than I should probably admit. Lydia felt something shift inside her chest, like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed. "You matter to me too." Caleb finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw everything he couldn't say, fear and hope, and something that looked dangerously like love. "I married you to buy time," he said quietly, "to save the ranch. That was the only reason, but now—" "Now?" "Now I'd marry you again for entirely different reasons." The confession settled over Lydia like snow, quiet and transformative. She'd spent 3 months working beside this man, learning his silences, his rare smiles, the way he moved through the world with fierce determination and hidden gentleness. She'd seen him at his worst, desperate, angry, afraid, and at his best, brave, protective, honorable in ways that had nothing to do with grand gestures and everything to do with small daily choices. When had her feelings shifted from gratitude to something deeper? When had this arrangement become real? "Caleb," she began, not knowing what she wanted to say, but knowing she needed to say something. Then the world exploded. The blast came from the direction of the rebuilt barn, a massive boom that shook the ground and sent both of them stumbling. Lydia's ears rang as she turned to see flames erupting from the structure, already twice as large as the fire that had consumed the original barn. "No!" Caleb was running before Lydia could stop him. She chased after him, her mind screaming that this was wrong. This was too big, too fast, too deliberate. They reached the barn to find it already engulfed, the heat so intense they couldn't get within 20 feet. The horses were screaming again. They'd moved the animals back into the rebuilt barn just 2 days ago. "The side door!" Lydia shouted over the roar of flames. They circled around, choking on smoke, and Caleb kicked in the smaller entrance. Flames licked at the doorframe, but the interior wasn't fully involved yet. The horses were wild with panic, throwing themselves against their stalls. Caleb plunged inside and Lydia followed, both of them working with desperate speed to free the animals. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. Lydia's lungs burned with each breath. They got the first 2 horses out. When Caleb went back for the third, part of the roof collapsed. "Caleb!" Lydia screamed. He emerged a moment later, covered in soot and bleeding from a gash on his forehead, the third horse bolting past him. But he was limping badly, favoring his right leg. "Are you hurt?" "Beam caught me." Caleb's face was tight with pain. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine. Blood was soaking through his pants where something had clearly injured him badly. The barn was fully involved now, flames reaching toward the sky. In the distance, Lydia could hear riders approaching. The volunteer fire brigade from town, alerted by the smoke. But this time, there would be nothing left to save. Caleb sank to the ground, his injured leg giving out. Lydia knelt beside him, trying to assess the damage. "This was Blackwell," Caleb said through gritted teeth. "Had to be. No natural fire burns this hot this fast. We'll prove it. He's escalating. Webb was right." Caleb's eyes were dark with a terrible understanding. "He's not going to stop until we're destroyed or dead." The volunteer brigade arrived and went to work containing the fire, but everyone could see it was futile. The barn was lost. Again. Margaret appeared at Lydia's side, taking in Caleb's injury with a sharp intake of breath. "We need to get him to the doctor." "No." Caleb tried to stand and nearly passed out. "Can't leave the ranch undefended." "You can barely stand." Margaret was already organizing help. "We're taking you to town. Lydia's coming with you, and we're posting armed guards here until you're well enough to return. I can't afford—" "You're not paying them. We are." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "This is our valley, too. If Blackwell thinks he can terrorize people into submission, he's wrong. Now stop being stubborn and let us help you." They got Caleb onto a wagon and into town. The doctor, a gruff man named Porter, examined the leg with practiced efficiency. "Deep laceration, possible fracture. You're lucky you can still walk on it." Porter began cleaning the wound, ignoring Caleb's hissed curses. "You'll need to stay off this leg for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. "I don't have 3 weeks." "You don't have a choice. Use it before it's healed and you risk permanent damage." Porter began stitching with neat, quick movements. "I'm serious, Ro. This isn't something you can push through." Lydia watched Caleb's face as the reality settled over him. 2 or 3 weeks unable to work the ranch, unable to defend it, unable to do anything but watch while Blackwell made his next move. "We'll manage," she said firmly. "The community is helping. We have guards posted. You focus on healing." But Caleb's expression said he didn't believe it would be enough. Margaret offered them a room above her restaurant, and Lydia accepted gratefully. They couldn't go back to the ranch, not with Caleb injured and unable to defend himself, and not with the very real possibility of another attack. That first night in town, Lydia sat by the window watching the street below while Caleb slept fitfully on the bed, his injured leg elevated and bandaged. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. They'd fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and for what? To be driven from their home anyway? To spend their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next attack? A soft knock came at the door. Lydia opened it to find Marshall Webb standing there, hat in hand. "Mrs. Rowe, sorry to disturb you so late. Can we talk?" She stepped into the hallway, closing the door quietly behind her. "I've been investigating the fire," Webb said without preamble. "Found evidence of accelerant. Someone doused that barn in kerosene before they lit it. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was attempted murder." Lydia's blood ran cold. "Can you prove Blackwell ordered it?" "Working on it. But here's the thing, Blackwell left town this afternoon. Took a coach east, supposedly on business. Very convenient timing." "He's running. Or establishing an alibi." Webb's expression was grim. "Either way, it means he's worried. The ranch hand's testimony rattled him more than we thought. He's making mistakes." "What do we do?" "You keep yourselves safe. I keep investigating, and we hope Blackwell makes one mistake too many before someone gets killed." After Webb left, Lydia returned to the room and found Caleb awake, his eyes fever-bright in the darkness. "Heard voices," he said hoarsely. Lydia told him what Webb had said. Caleb listened in silence, his jaw tight. "He's scared," Caleb said when she finished. "Good. Scared men make mistakes. Scared men also become dangerous." He was already dangerous. Caleb shifted, wincing. "Question is whether we can survive long enough for the law to catch up to him." "We will." Lydia sat on the edge of the bed. "We've survived everything else." "Have we?" Caleb's voice was bitter. "The barn is gone. The ranch is under guard because we can't protect it ourselves. I'm laid up and useless. Blackwell is still free. What exactly have we survived?" "Each other," Lydia said quietly. "We survived becoming partners, survived learning to trust, survived admitting that this marriage became something more than a transaction." Caleb's eyes found hers in the dim light. "Did it? Become something more?" "You know it did." "Say it anyway. I need to hear it." Lydia took a breath, feeling like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "I care about you, Caleb. Somewhere between mending fences and preserving vegetables and fighting fires, I stopped seeing you as the stranger who married me out of desperation. You became everything. My partner, my friend, the person I trust most in the world." "But," Caleb prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice, "but I don't know if that's enough. If what I feel is love or just gratitude. If what you feel is real or just the result of us being thrown together by circumstance." "It's real," Caleb said immediately. "At least for me, it's real." "How do you know?" "Because when that barn was burning, my first thought wasn't about saving the horses or the property or any of it. It was about you. Making sure you were safe, making sure I didn't lose you." His voice roughened. "I'd let the whole ranch burn if it meant keeping you alive. That's how I know." Lydia felt tears sliding down her face. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's also the truth." Caleb reached for her hand. "I know the timing is terrible. I know we're in the middle of fighting for our lives. But I need you to know this isn't about the ranch anymore. It's about you. About us. About wanting a future that has nothing to do with debts or land or any of it." "What kind of future?" "One where we're together because we choose to be. Not because we're desperate or trapped or using each other. Because we want to be." Lydia squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses she'd come to know so well. "I want that too." "Then we fight for it. Not just the ranch, us. We fight for the right to have a real marriage. A real life. Together," Lydia confirmed. "Together." They stayed like that, hands clasped in the darkness, until Caleb's pain medication pulled him back into uneasy sleep. Lydia sat watch through the night, her mind churning with plans and fears, and a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. She'd come west expecting a marriage of convenience and found humiliation instead. Then she'd found partnership, hard work, and slowly, carefully, something that felt like love. She'd be damned if she let Harrison Blackwell take that away. The next morning brought unexpected news. Marshall Webb returned with information that changed everything. Blackwell's ranch hand gave us more testimony, names, dates, payments. And here's the interesting part. Blackwell wasn't just targeting you. He's been systematically driving small ranchers off their land for years, buying up their properties at bankruptcy prices, consolidating power. How many? Lydia asked. At least 7 operations over the past decade. All of them had mysterious accidents, harassment, financial pressure. All of them lost their land. All of it went to Blackwell. Caleb sat up straighter despite his injury. Can you prove it? With the ranch hand's testimony and some digging through land records? Yes, absolutely. Webb's expression was almost satisfied. Blackwell made a career out of this, but he got sloppy with you because he was angry. Personal grudges make people careless. What does this mean? Lydia asked. It means we have enough to charge him with multiple counts of conspiracy, arson, attempted murder, and fraud. His trial just became a lot more serious and a lot more public. He'll fight it. Of course he will. A man like that has resources, but he doesn't have the moral high ground anymore. And in this territory, that matters. Webb stood to leave. Keep yourselves safe. Stay in town for now. I'll let you know when it's secure to go home. After he left, Lydia and Caleb sat in stunned silence. We might actually win this, Caleb said finally. We might. And then what? Then we rebuild. Again. Lydia managed a tired smile. We seem to be good at that. The barn, the fences, the cattle we lost. It'll take months to recover. We have months. We have time. Lydia moved to sit beside him on the bed. We have each other. That's enough to start with. Caleb reached up and touched her face, his scarred hand gentle against her cheek. When this is over, when Blackwell is dealt with and the ranch is safe, I want to do this right. Do what right? Us. This marriage. His eyes were intense. I want to court you properly, take you to dinner, buy you flowers, all the things I should have done if we'd met under normal circumstances. Lydia laughed, the sound surprising her. Caleb, we've been married for 3 months. We've survived fires and attacks and bankruptcy together. I think we're past the courting stage. Maybe. But you deserve romance. You deserve to be wooed. I don't need romance. I need honesty, partnership, someone who sees me as an equal. You have that. You've always had that. Then that's enough. Lydia leaned in and kissed him, soft and careful, mindful of his injuries. When they pulled apart, Caleb was smiling, a real smile that transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful. I love you, he said. Simple, direct, true. I love you too, Lydia replied, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They stayed in town for 2 weeks while Caleb healed and Marshal Webb built his case against Harrison Blackwell. During that time, something shifted in how the townspeople treated them. No longer were they the desperate rancher and the humiliated mail-order bride. They became symbols of resistance, proof that standing up to bullies and corruption could work. People brought them food, visited to share news and gossip, offered help in ways large and small. Margaret told Lydia privately, "You changed something here, made people remember that we're stronger together than apart. That matters more than you know." When they finally returned to the ranch, they found it transformed. The community had rebuilt the barn, not exactly as it had been, but solid and functional. The fences were reinforced, the garden was weeded and tended. Someone had even repaired the porch steps. A note was tacked to the door. Welcome home. We've got your back. Lydia stood in the yard, taking it all in, and felt tears streaming down her face. They did all this, she whispered. We're not alone anymore, Caleb said, his arm around her shoulders. Never thought I'd say that again. That evening, as they settled back into the house that now felt truly like home, Caleb cleared his throat awkwardly. There's something I need to tell you. Lydia looked up from where she was organizing supplies. What is it? That first night, in the saloon, when I offered to marry you. Caleb was staring at his hands. I told you it was purely practical, that I needed the legal standing to renegotiate the debt. I remember. That was true, but it wasn't the only reason. He finally met her eyes. When I saw you standing there, humiliated and alone, I saw myself. After my fiancé left, after my father died, after everything fell apart. I knew exactly how you felt, like the world had labeled you worthless, and nothing you did would change that label. So you felt sorry for me? No, I felt connected to you. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. I saw someone who refused to collapse even when she had every reason to. Someone who still had fight left despite everything. And I thought, maybe that's the kind of person who could survive this. Could survive me and my disaster of a ranch and all the problems that came with it. You chose me because you saw strength. I chose you because I recognized a kindred spirit. Caleb reached for her hand. I told myself it was business, pure practicality. But even then, some part of me knew it was more than that. Some part of me was already hoping this could become real. Lydia absorbed this, feeling pieces of their history rearrange themselves into a new pattern. You could have told me. I barely understood it myself. It took months of working beside you, watching you refuse to break, seeing your courage and your kindness and your stubborn determination to build something from nothing. That's when I understood what I'd felt that first night was the beginning of love. The beginning, Lydia repeated softly. The middle is what we've been living. All the hard work and the fights and the partnership. Caleb pulled her close. Now I want the rest of it, the future. Growing old together. Building a life that's ours because we chose it, not because desperation forced it on us. I want that too, Lydia said. All of it. They stood together in the house they'd saved through sheer determination, in the ranch that had become their shared mission, and Lydia felt something settle inside her. A certainty that whatever came next, whether it was easy or hard, triumphant or challenging, they would face it together. Not because they had no other choice, but because they'd chosen each other. And that choice, made freely by two people who'd learned to see each other's true worth, was stronger than any bond forced by desperation could ever be. The trial began on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after the final barn fire. Lydia and Caleb rode into town together, his legs still stiff but healed enough that he could walk without limping. The territorial courthouse was packed, every seat filled, people standing in the aisles, more crowded outside the windows trying to hear. Harrison Blackwell sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, flanked by two lawyers who looked like they cost more than most people earned in a year. His expression was carefully neutral, but Lydia caught the flash of rage in his eyes when he saw her and Caleb enter the courtroom. The prosecutor was a woman named Catherine Reeves, sent from the territorial capital specifically for this case. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, with a reputation for destroying powerful men who thought themselves above the law. The territory versus Harrison Blackwell, the judge intoned, on charges of conspiracy, arson, attempted murder, fraud, and criminal intimidation. How does the defendant plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. One of Blackwell's lawyers stood smoothly. My client is a respected businessman being targeted by envious rivals and opportunistic fortune seekers. Reeves didn't even blink. The prosecution will demonstrate that Harrison Blackwell engaged in a systematic campaign of terror against multiple ranching families over the course of 10 years, culminating in attempted murder. We have testimony, physical evidence, and documented patterns of behavior that prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that the defendant is guilty of every charge. The trial lasted 3 days. Reeves built her case methodically, calling witness after witness, former ranch hands who testified about being paid to sabotage competitors' operations, land office clerks who showed patterns of property transfers always flowing to Blackwell after mysterious disasters, the banker who admitted under oath that Blackwell had approached him about accelerating foreclosures on specific properties. And then there was Thomas Wade, Blackwell's former foreman, who laid out the entire operation in brutal detail. Mr. Blackwell had a system, Wade testified, his voice flat and emotionless. He'd identify properties he wanted, small operations usually, places that were struggling but had good land or water rights. Then he'd make them struggle more. Cut fences, poison water, start fires, whatever it took to push them over the edge. And you participated in these activities? Reeves asked. Yes, ma'am. For 3 years I did exactly what he paid me to do. Why are you testifying now? Wade was quiet for a moment. Because the Rowe place was different. Blackwell didn't just want their land, he wanted them destroyed, kept pushing for more violent tactics. When he ordered us to set that second barn fire with people inside, Wade's jaw tightened. I got children of my own. I couldn't be part of murder. Blackwell's lawyers tried to tear Wade apart on cross-examination, painting him as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But Wade's testimony was too detailed, too corroborated by other evidence to dismiss. Then Caleb took the stand. He testified about the harassment, the fires, the attacks, described finding his cattle poisoned, his fences cut, his barn burning with Lydia inside trying to save the horses. His voice remained steady throughout, but Lydia saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his scarred hand gripped the railing. When Blackwell's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his strategy became clear immediately. Mr. Rowe, isn't it true that your ranch was failing long before my client allegedly began this supposed harassment? It was struggling, Caleb admitted, but I was managing. Managing? You were drowning in debt, couldn't pay your hands, couldn't maintain your property, and then suddenly, conveniently, you marry a stranger and start making wild accusations against one of the most respected men in the valley. Objection! Reeves was on her feet. Counsel is testifying, not questioning. Sustained. Rephrase, counselor. The lawyer smiled coldly. Mr. Rowe, isn't it possible that your financial troubles and subsequent marriage to Mrs. Rowe were simply desperate attempts to save a failing operation? And these accusations against Mr. Blackwell are an extension of that desperation? No. Caleb's voice was hard. What's desperate is trying to destroy people who've done nothing to you except refuse to disappear when you humiliate them. You're speaking of your wife's unfortunate experience at the saloon? I'm speaking of a pattern of cruelty that everyone in this valley knows about, but has been too afraid to challenge until now. The lawyer's expression soured. No further questions. Then it was Lydia's turn. She walked to the stand with her head high, very conscious of every eye in the courtroom watching her. This was the woman who'd been publicly mocked, who'd married a stranger within an hour, who'd somehow survived everything Blackwell had thrown at her and come out stronger. Reeves led her through the events gently but thoroughly. The letter that had brought her west, the saloon humiliation, the marriage to Caleb, the systematic harassment that had followed. Mrs. Rowe, why do you believe Mr. Blackwell targeted you and your husband so viciously? Lydia looked directly at Blackwell. Because I didn't disappear. He wanted me to be ashamed, to slink away and prove he was right to call me worthless. Instead, I stayed. I built something, and every jar I sold, every fence I mended, every morning I woke up still standing, it was proof that his judgment of me was wrong. Men like Harrison Blackwell can't tolerate being proven wrong. Objection. Speculation about my client's character. Overruled. The witness may answer. He made it personal, Lydia continued. And in doing so, he made mistakes. He got sloppy. And now he's here answering for everything he's done. Not just to us, but to all the families he destroyed over the years. When Blackwell's lawyer approached for cross-examination, his strategy was even more transparent than it had been with Caleb. Mrs. Rowe, you came west seeking a husband through a matrimonial service, correct? Yes. And when that didn't work out, you immediately married the first man who offered within hours of being rejected by my client? I married a good man who offered me a fair partnership. A partnership? Is that what you call a marriage of pure convenience entered into by two desperate people? Lydia didn't flinch. I call it a choice we both made freely, which is more than can be said for the ranching families your client terrorized into giving up their land. You're deflecting, Mrs. Rowe. The question is about your credibility, about whether a woman desperate enough to marry a complete stranger might also be desperate enough to fabricate accusations. I fabricated nothing. Lydia's voice cut through the courtroom. My house was attacked. My husband was injured. Our barn was burned twice. Our cattle were poisoned. These aren't fabrications. They're documented facts that multiple witnesses have corroborated. But you're also the woman who was publicly humiliated by my client, are you not? You have personal reasons to want revenge. I have personal reasons to want justice. Lydia leaned forward. There's a difference. Revenge would be meeting cruelty with cruelty. Justice is standing here and telling the truth so that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. No further questions. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Lydia and Caleb waited outside the courthouse with Margaret, her husband, and a crowd of townspeople who'd come to show support. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when the bailiff finally emerged. Jury's reached a verdict. Everyone back inside. The courtroom filled again, the tension so thick Lydia could hardly breathe. She gripped Caleb's hand as the jury filed back in, trying to read their faces and finding nothing. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, a weathered rancher named McAllister whom Lydia recognized from the volunteer fire brigade. "On the charge of conspiracy, how do you find?" "Guilty." A ripple went through the courtroom. Blackwell's face remained impassive, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the table. "On the charge of arson? Guilty." "On the charge of attempted murder?" "Guilty." "On the charge of fraud?" "Guilty." "On the charge of criminal intimidation?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. People were shouting, crying, embracing. The judge hammered his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Lydia sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Guilty. On all counts. Caleb pulled her into his arms, and she realized she was crying. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." But it wasn't quite over yet. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. Blackwell stood before the judge, his expensive lawyers having abandoned him after the verdict, his face haggard and aged. Judge Morrison was a no-nonsense man who'd seen frontier justice evolve from vigilante hangings to actual rule of law. He looked at Blackwell with something that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "Harrison Blackwell, you have been found guilty of multiple serious crimes committed over the course of a decade. You used your wealth and influence to terrorize honest families, to steal their land, to endanger their lives. You represent everything wrong with unchecked power and privilege." Blackwell stood silent, his jaw tight. "However, I also note that no one was killed in these attacks. The attempted murder charges stem from reckless endangerment rather than premeditated killing. And you have no prior criminal record." Lydia felt her stomach drop. He was going to be lenient. "That said," Morrison continued, "your crimes were systematic, repeated, and showed complete disregard for human life and the rule of law. Therefore, I sentence you to 15 years in territorial prison. Additionally, all property you acquired through fraudulent means, which according to the prosecution's evidence includes approximately 3,000 acres, will be returned to the families from whom it was taken or sold at public auction to compensate victims." 15 years. Lydia let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Furthermore," Morrison added, "you are permanently barred from holding any position of public trust in this territory and from engaging in any business related to land acquisition or ranching." "Do you understand these terms?" "Yes." Blackwell's voice was barely audible. "Then may this serve as a lesson. In this territory, we are building a society of laws, not of powerful men who believe themselves above those laws." Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. Blackwell was led away in chains. He didn't look at Lydia or Caleb as he passed, his eyes fixed straight ahead, the proud land baron reduced to just another convicted criminal. Outside the courthouse, Margaret threw her arms around Lydia. "You did it! You actually did it!" "We did it," Lydia corrected. "All of us. You, the community, everyone who stood up and testified." "But you started it." Margaret pulled back, smiling through tears. "You refused to disappear. That's what made the difference." Over the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. The ranch that had nearly killed them to save became the foundation of something stronger. With Blackwell's property being liquidated, several small ranchers who'd lost land to his schemes were able to buy back their original homesteads at fair prices. Others, who'd been too broken by the experience to start over, received financial compensation. The valley began to heal from a decade of systematic predation. Caleb and Lydia used the compensation from the trial, along with the steady income from Lydia's preserving business, which had grown substantially, to expand their operation. They bought cattle to rebuild the herd, hired 2 ranch hands who testified against Blackwell and needed work, fixed everything that had been held together with hope and wire. The garden flourished. Lydia planted it 3 times larger than before, and Margaret helped her establish contracts with buyers as far away as the territorial capital. What had started as a desperate attempt to save the ranch became a thriving business in its own right. But more than the physical transformation, something else changed. The marriage that had begun as a transaction, evolved through partnership, and deepened into love, finally became what both of them had secretly hoped for from the beginning: a true union built on choice rather than desperation. 6 months after the trial, on a spring morning when wildflowers covered the hills and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Caleb found Lydia in the garden. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her to the rise behind the house where they'd stood the day she first saw the full extent of the ranch's problems. But this time, instead of devastation, Lydia saw thriving pastures filled with cattle, fences that stood straight and strong, a barn that gleamed with fresh paint, fields of vegetables arranged in neat, productive rows. "This is what we built," Caleb said quietly. "Not what my father left me. Not what I was desperately trying to preserve. What we created together, from almost nothing." Lydia leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady strength that had been there from the beginning, even when everything else was falling apart. "I was thinking," Caleb continued, "that maybe it's time we had that wedding. We're already married. Legally, yes, but I want to do it right, in front of everyone. Not because we're desperate or hiding or fighting for survival, because we choose each other and want to celebrate that." Lydia turned to face him, seeing the vulnerability in his scarred face, the hope he was trying to contain. "You want a real wedding. I want to stand up in front of this whole valley and tell them that you're my wife, not because circumstances forced us together, but because I love you, because you're the strongest, bravest, most relentless person I've ever met, because you saw me at my absolute worst and decided I was worth saving anyway." "You saved yourself," Lydia said softly. "I just stood beside you while you did it." "No, we saved each other." Caleb took both her hands. "So what do you say? Will you marry me again, Lydia Rowe? This time for all the right reasons?" Lydia felt joy bubbling up inside her, bright and overwhelming. "Yes, absolutely yes." The wedding took place on a summer evening under the cottonwood trees by the creek. Half the valley attended: Margaret and her family, the ranch hands who'd testified against Blackwell, the volunteer fire brigade, the townspeople who'd contributed money when Lydia and Caleb needed it most, even Marshal Webb in his formal uniform. Reverend Shaw performed the ceremony, and this time his words carried weight and meaning instead of rote obligation. "Marriage is more than a legal contract," he said, looking between Lydia and Caleb. "It's a choice made daily to stand beside another person through whatever comes. These two have already proven they understand that truth better than most couples married for decades. They faced tests that would have destroyed lesser partnerships, and they came through stronger." Caleb wore a new suit, his first in years. Lydia wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her sew, with wildflowers woven into her hair. When Shaw asked if they would take each other as husband and wife, they answered in unison, their voices clear and certain. "I will." And when Caleb kissed her this time, it wasn't with the desperate uncertainty of two strangers gambling on an impossible future. It was with the confidence of two people who knew exactly what they were choosing and why. The celebration lasted until the stars came out. There was food Margaret had prepared, music from a fiddle player who'd come all the way from the next county, dancing under lanterns strung from the trees. People gave toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. Children ran through the darkness playing games while their parents talked and laughed. Late in the evening, Lydia found herself sitting with a group of women by the fire. They were discussing the upcoming harvest, comparing preserving techniques, sharing gossip about neighboring towns. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, who'd recently arrived seeking work, turned to Lydia. "Is it true you came here as a mail-order bride?" The conversation stopped. Everyone looked at Lydia, waiting to see if the question had crossed a line. Lydia smiled. "It's true. I answered an advertisement, traveled 1,000 miles, and got rejected in front of a crowded saloon. Then I married Caleb within an hour of meeting him." "That must have been terrifying." "It was." Lydia looked across the gathering to where Caleb stood talking with some ranchers, his face animated in a way it never would have been a year ago. "But it was also the best decision I ever made. Not because it was safe or sensible or what I'd planned, because it led me here, to this life, to these people, to him. Do you ever regret it? Sarah asked quietly. Coming west? Never. Lydia meant it with every fiber of her being. I thought I was coming here to find security, to escape a life where I was invisible and disposable. Instead, I found purpose, community, love. I found out who I really was when I stopped trying to be what others expected. Margaret raised her glass. To Lydia, who taught us all what real strength looks like. To Lydia, the women echoed. Later, when the guests had finally departed and the lanterns were being extinguished, Caleb and Lydia walked back to their house hand in hand. Happy? Caleb asked. Deliriously. Lydia leaned her head on his shoulder. You? More than I knew how to be. He stopped walking, turning to face her in the darkness. A year ago, I was convinced I'd lose everything. The ranch, my father's legacy, any chance at a real life. I was just trying to survive long enough to maybe salvage something from the wreckage. And now? Now I've got more than I ever dreamed possible. A thriving ranch, a real partnership, a community that actually cares. And you, his voice roughened with emotion. You most of all. You came into my life like a storm and changed everything. I could say the same about you. Lydia touched his scarred face gently. You gave me a chance when I had nothing, treated me like an equal when the world saw me as worthless, showed me what it meant to fight for something that mattered. We were good for each other. We were perfect for each other. We just didn't know it yet. They stood together under the stars, on the land they'd saved through sheer determination, surrounded by the life they'd built from desperation and hope. What do you think happens next? Lydia asked, after the happy ending. This isn't an ending, Caleb pulled her close. It's a beginning. The first chapter of the real story, the one where we get to choose our future instead of having it forced on us. And what do you choose? You. Always you. Everything else is just details. Lydia kissed him, tasting promise and hope and the sweet knowledge that they'd earned every moment of happiness that lay ahead. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb grinned. Come on, we've got a ranch to run in the morning, and preserving orders to fill, and cattle to check, and a garden to tend, and a life to build. Together, Lydia said firmly. Together, Caleb agreed. They walked into their home, the house that had been a disaster when Lydia first arrived, but now gleamed with care and attention. The place where they'd learned to trust each other, to work together, to transform a business arrangement into genuine partnership and then into love. A year ago, Lydia had stood in a saloon, publicly humiliated, with no future and no hope. She'd been labeled worthless by a man who thought he had the power to define her value. Now she stood in her own home, on her own land, with a husband who saw her true worth. She'd built a business that provided for others, helped bring a criminal to justice, found a community that valued her contributions, discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. The woman who'd been mocked and dismissed had become someone the valley respected, someone people turned to for advice and help, someone who'd proven that worth wasn't defined by circumstances or other people's judgment, but by what you chose to do when faced with impossible odds. Lydia had crossed a continent chasing a promise that turned out to be a lie. But in the ruins of that broken promise, she'd found something infinitely better, a truth about herself, a partnership built on mutual respect, and a love that had been forged in fire and tested by every hardship imaginable. She'd been shaped by desperation, strengthened by struggle, and refined by determination into exactly the person she was meant to be. And that person was finally, completely, triumphantly home. As Lydia drifted to sleep that night in Caleb's arms, her last thought was of the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach months ago, frightened, alone, gambling everything on a stranger's word. She wished she could tell that woman what waited on the other side of all that fear. You will survive this. You will thrive. You will discover that you're not worthless or disposable or any of the things they called you. You're strong enough to build a life from ashes, brave enough to stand up to those who try to destroy you, wise enough to recognize love when it appears in unexpected places. And most importantly, you're enough, exactly as you are, always have been, always will be. The future Lydia had dreamed of when she answered that matrimonial advertisement had been small and safe. A husband, a home, security. Nothing more. The future she'd actually found was vast and challenging and absolutely worth every moment of struggle it had taken to claim it. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the valley and the work began again, Lydia would face it not as a desperate woman clinging to survival, but as a partner, a businesswoman, a valued member of her community, and a wife who'd chosen love freely instead of accepting it out of desperation. The mail-order bride who never was had become something far better, a woman who knew her own worth and refused to let anyone diminish it ever again. That, Lydia thought as sleep finally claimed her, was the real happy ending. Not rescue, not escape, not even survival, but transformation, choice, and the fierce, unshakable knowledge that she'd earned every bit of happiness that was finally completely hers.